Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, ethics students. So today we complete our consideration of the ontology of ethics. And we're on point G. And remember, the sentences begin with essential properties. So essential properties entail a metaphysics of finality. This means that the property aims toward the end, right? As it says, and it says this is a key, this is the crux in G2, a disposition is a tendency toward a specific end. So the ends and the dispositions and the goals of our nature as human beings are not random. They are pointed in a certain direction, and they are, in a sense, intended to achieve a certain goal. And as it notes there, you might want to review F8. On to H. Essential properties entail truth as a correspondence between mind and thing. So this not only has a metaphysical aspect, these ontological considerations, but also has an epistemological aspect. So the question then becomes, well, how do we know? How do we know anything about our nature? How do we know what's good for us? How do we know what's not good for us, etc. Right? And so you have a very simple definition of truth given to you there in H1. Truth is a relation between a concept and a thing. So if we know something accurately, right, that's then a true idea. If we do not have an accurate idea, if we don't know something, the idea is false. Now, when we're dealing with something like the aspects of human nature, they are to a large extent infinite, and therefore cannot be known completely. So, in a sense, the best that we can say is either that we're on the right track or we're not on the right track. We're attempting to understand and somewhat succeeding, or we're attempting, or maybe not trying too hard to understand, and probably not succeeding. So notice that when we have knowledge of something being good, that's because we understand the goal or we understand the purpose. If we have knowledge of something being evil, that's because we understand that what's under consideration is contrary to the purpose. So when we look at human actions, when we look at human affairs, when we look at actions that we perform as human beings, if we understand that in terms of our ultimate goal, remember those concepts we had previously of the summum bonum and the totum bonum, the highest good and the whole good, if we understand that we're, in a sense, kind of putting together the aspects of a good life, then that's knowledge of good. On the other hand, when we engage in actions, as we all do, that don't fit into those categories, those very general categories of putting together a good life, then we do things that aren't good. And that's very common. We all do that, right? Reality is something that, at least to some extent, and usually to a large extent, that we can know, right? And elements of reality, in terms of how they are, give us an indication of what's good. So the better that we know reality, the idea is here, the better that we know reality, the better we can get an idea of what's good. The better we know true and complete and accurately what human nature is, the better that we can understand what good human actions are. Yes, there is a psychological component to ethics, but it has to be good psychology and not psychology that is, let's say, informed by various sorts of worldly ideologies. This understanding in H is, again, what we've encountered before, an Aristotelian type of moderate realism. So it's not exactly what Plato said, although it's to some extent dependent upon Plato, but it's certainly not what someone like David Hume would propose. All right. On to I. Essential properties are the basis for moral properties. What we are is the basis of what we should be. Right? And so number one is pretty self-explanatory, right? When we complete our human essence in its development, that leads to or tends toward our well-being. It tends toward the goodness of our human life as a human person. Now, we've seen I too before, right? The idea that objectively speaking, what we're using as a standard of right action is a fulfilled human nature or a flourishing human being. Now remember there in parenthesis, it's not really a parenthetical remark, in parenthesis it says objectively speaking. These determinations about what it is to flourish or what it is to be fully functioning are not just based on what looks good to us or what we like or what we prefer. Our preferences or our likes or our wants may or may not, on the classical realist view, be in line with what is really good or what we ought to do. This is what we were looking at in previous classes and previous chapters in terms of the connection between right desire and right action. So our desires are either in the category of ordered, therefore oriented toward our proper human end, or our desires could be in the category of disordered, meaning that they are leading us away from our proper human end. Are these questions at this point kind of abstract? Are these questions hard to figure out even in the concrete? Of course. That's the nature of life. If all of these questions were easy, we could teach all of this and all of us could sail through life without all the ambiguities and seeming contradictions that we either have encountered and certainly will encounter and do encounter constantly. All right. I3 is a key. For classical realism, for the natural law, the foundation of ethics is human nature, the human person. You could say human dignity if you want. And human nature is what it is, and it's not created by virtue of an individual's whim or a society's whim. That's W-H-I-M, right? Just sort of a passing desire. What do we have to have? It asks in I4. What do we have to understand the idea of the natural law? And you remember that's what we studied when we looked at Aquinas several weeks ago. Knowledge of the essence of the human person. So the more we study what we are as human beings, not just from a scientifically psychological point of view, although it includes that, but the more that we study what we are in terms of our temperament, in terms of our human relationships, in terms of our natural abilities, our natural talents and so forth, the more that we study what we are, essentially, in the ways in which we're all the same, and in addition to that, the more that we study what we are as the individual that we are, the more that we are able to understand this idea of the natural law. The dispositions that we were speaking of previously lead to obligations. In other words, we have a disposition for knowledge. We have a disposition for friendship. We have a disposition to attempt to integrate our lives in various ways. We have a disposition, actually, if you want to look on the physical level, to be healthy. The human goods, that list that we saw earlier in this general list, are indicative of dispositions. Dispositions obligate us to act in accord with the goals toward which they point. Right? This is what is being emphasized in these middle points here in letter I, right? The goal or the end to which the disposition points is our duty. Moving toward that end, towards which our disposition points us, is our duty. This is not sort of an arbitrarily conceived duty, as we saw in Kant. This is a duty based on our essential nature, the essential properties that make us what we are as human beings. So, in a sense, just by being a person, we're obligated to work toward our own fulfillment. Aristotle would probably be very blunt about it. He would say, if you don't work toward your own fulfillment, if you work contrary to your fulfillment in any way, you're bad. That's essentially what it means to be a bad person. And he would not be impressed with the modern world, which says, but I like it. I like not working toward my own fulfillment. It feels better, it's more enjoyable, it's more pleasurable. Aristotle wouldn't care, right? There is an objective nature which is ours, and therefore there are objective duties which we should fulfill, right? He's not looking at it from an otherworldly point of view. He's not saying that if you don't do this, you're going to go to hell, or if you do this, you're going to go to heaven. Remember, Aristotle was a pre-Christian pagan, essentially. He's looking at human nature as it is in each person, and seeing in that nature the formation of obligation. All right. Number 11. Moral properties are the ground and the content of the human essence. Now, by the time that we're down to I, you're beginning to see that some of these sentences, yes, are saying the same thing in a slightly different way. They're emphasizing I3. Ethics has its foundation in human nature. So as you read through, don't think of it as repetitive. Don't think of it as redundant. Think of it as a good review of what the theory of classical realism and the natural law says. Just remember our ultimate goal here. We're looking at two theories: theory of the natural law, classical realism, the theory of voluntarism. And what we're ultimately trying to do is make a judgment for ourselves in our own life, which ethical theory is true, which one seems to be more in line with reality, which one is more consistent with what I can know as a reasonable human being. All right, J. Essential properties make possible a metaphysics of morals. Now, we're talking about the ontology of morals, and now you have this phrase in quotes, the metaphysics of morals. And it asks some fundamental questions, right? What's the ultimate explanation for reality? Is there a reality that is what it is in itself? So you look at these various types of knowledge, right? And we're concerned with 3B. Ethics and philosophy is not concerned merely with science. Ethics and philosophy is not concerned with what we associate with theology. We're concerned with 3B. We're concerned with knowing our nature, which involves our intellect, but because we are dealing with infinite realities, it does take us beyond our intellect. All right. Now, based on that idea that we see there in J3, we note that there are two types of reason. One which we would call theoretical, where the mind conforms to the thing. We do this constantly when we're studying something. An example given there is chemistry, right? We just don't go in and make it up in chemistry class. Our mind has to conform to the way it is, right? On the other hand, if we're involved in the creation of an artistic production, the thing corresponds to our mind, right? And so I think of a potter, right? So he's got an idea of something that he wants to make. That the objects, the clay that he's working with, has to correspond to the idea that he has in his mind, right? So those human goods that we talked about before are like these metaphysical realities that we're talking about. For example, when we say that we have an inclination to knowledge, knowledge is sort of a metaphysical reality. We just don't walk out the front door in the morning and say, well, okay, today I'm going to pursue knowledge. we have to do something concrete. Knowledge is the metaphysical reality that sort of provides the context for what we're doing, but there's not enough there. There has to be a concrete action that fulfills that desire to attain knowledge of various sorts. All right. As we look at ourselves as human beings, we see that, again, the point made back in F7, our good as a human being is not something that's added on to us. We're not good as a human being because someone says we're good. We're good because we're a human being. And we're not, in terms of our nature, actually a bad human being, even if we perform bad actions. If that were the case, we would all be bad human beings, right? Aristotle might be a little harsh in that sense. We still retain our dignity, regardless of how old we are or how young we are, what our capabilities are, any other factors that are not essential do not detract from our human dignity. This will be a lot more apparent when we move into the final segment of the class and discuss a couple of controversial issues. So number 12 summarizes this pretty well, I think. The connection between the fact and the value. Remember, this was Hume's big problem, right? Values only came from feelings. Science gave us facts, and there was no connection between fact and value. So here you see the classical realist sort of rejoinder to Hume, right? The value is not derived from the fact as much as is built into the fact. It's not that it's derived from the fact as much that we notice that the value is already there, built into the fact, right? In the same way, as it says here, that actualization is built into potency, right? So now we're getting to a few conclusions. And here's a starting point. If the goal towards which we're striving perfects what we are, namely our essence, and if what perfects what we are, our essence, is human flourishing, then that's our goal. Our goal is to flourish as a human being. When you think about that, you think that's another one of those statements that is very difficult to think the opposite of. I don't want to flourish as a human being? What kind of life would that be? What kind of human element would be included in that? And the only way that most of the time we think that people say that, or even ourselves, is if there's some sort of psychological disorder that's either temporary or permanent. Maybe I'm feeling overwhelmed, maybe I'm anxious, I just can't deal with it anymore, I don't care about any of this fulfillment stuff. Okay, well that's sort of a temporary aberration. That doesn't really have any philosophical foundation. We don't live our lives based on those kinds of realities. We live our lives on what we can know about our essence and what will best lead us to this prospect, in this direction of flourishing. So if we're not flourishing, what are we doing? Well, we're not acting consistently with our natural dispositions. It's a question we can ask ourselves when things aren't going well, when things aren't going the way that we think that they should. Why not? Why aren't they? And we can think back to this. We think, well, am I trying to act contrary to my natural dispositions? Am I trying to do something that's really contrary to reason and contrary to nature? Is that the problem? I can tell you from personal experience, that's happened to me many times in life. Things don't seem to be going the way they're supposed to be going. I look at the actions that I'm performing, how I'm thinking about them, how I'm approving of my own actions, what I like, what I'm finding pleasure in, what I'm enjoying, and I'm finding, hey, this is not leading anywhere good. This is not really in line with my human essence. Now, you don't have to use those exact terms. You don't have to go around, analyzing yourself philosophically in terms of your human essence. But essentially, that's what we're doing. Right? When we say we're not moving in the right direction, we're not, in a sense, acting in the way that a human being would naturally act. Now, at the 20-minute mark, we finally get to K, the final item on the list. Essential properties mean that reason takes priority over the will. So you remember that threefold division of the human being that we've discussed several times: the intellect, the will, and the passions or the emotions. The intellect, in this view, is the ruling element. It takes priority. So this is a non-voluntarist theory. A voluntarist theory is one that puts the will on the top. This theory puts the reason on the top. So if you want to look back at these two types of reason that we have, theoretical and practical, we can see that it's theoretical reason that enables us to understand, at least to some extent, the content of what we are as a human being. And it's by virtue of practical reason, back to prudence again, momentarily if you want, it's by means of practical reason that we understand what we ought to do in order to act in accord with our essential nature. All right? So to get to that idea of the obligatory end, you have to go back and review the metaphysics of finality, as it says there in number K5, CG. Go back and look at it. Study these points. See how they all tie together, right? The ends, the goals, the purposes here that we're talking about, again, are very Aristotelian, Thomistic, realist. They're objective. They don't vary just because we're a different person. They're essentially the same for everybody. They're universal, and they're knowable, right? The phrase that you see and have seen in your book several times, in that quote from Cicero, for example, that we saw earlier, is the phrase right reason. So when we understand human nature accurately and we act in accord with that human nature, we're engaged in the exercise of right reason. We can act contrary to that, and that might be referred to as acting irrationally or unreasonably. 11 and 12 are summations, right? The ends which make up, or the purposes which make up the human essence, these essential properties, right? They flow from those essential properties. As we understand them theoretically and as we pursue them in terms of prudence, tell us what is our duty. And our duty is to flourish, right? We have a duty to flourish in that Aristotelian sense of eudaimonia, of a whole life well lived. We have a duty, as much as possible, to live a life that as a whole is as well lived as we can possibly make it. All right, well, that probably is somewhat of a briefer presentation than I would have been able to give if we were face to face, because there could have been a little bit more give and take and so forth. But we're hitting probably, I guess maybe the mark of our longest video, hitting just past the 23.5-minute mark. I was able to clear up some peculiarities with my phone, so that's no longer an issue. Okay, we finished the theoretical part, except for maybe a little summation at the end. We're going to spend the next few classes dealing with two controversial issues. First will come euthanasia, and then will come abortion. In between there, we'll meet up with the issue of infanticide and so forth. So, good luck to you, and I'll see you next class.